It was a cold, gray morning when the call came in. Sergeant Henry Owens, a battle-hardened soldier who had just returned from a grueling tour overseas, stood still in the middle of his small front yard, gripping his phone with trembling hands. The sun had barely started to rise over the sleepy American town of Treston, but something was very wrong. He had received a call that no one should ever have to take. "There's been an incident at your home, Sergeant," the officer on the line said. "You need to come down to the station immediately." Henry's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he thought about his life, his family, his wife, and his partner. Everything seemed fine last night. They had sat together, eaten dinner, laughed, even made plans for the weekend. But now, with a cold dread seeping into his bones, Henry felt something deep inside him shift. The air was thick with anticipation as Henry drove to the station. His head was spinning with questions, but the most prominent one kept repeating itself. What had happened? His mind tried to make sense of it all, but all he could come up with was confusion. When he arrived at the police station, the officers didn't offer much information. A tall, somber detective named Jennifer Ford stepped forward. She was a seasoned investigator, known for solving even the toughest cases. Her eyes met Henry's, and without wasting any time, she spoke. "We need to talk, Sergeant Owens. It's about your wife, Lily, and your partner, James." The words hung in the air like poison, slowly sinking in. His chest tightened. What had happened to them? Ford led him into a small room at the back of the station, the walls pale and the lights harsh, flickering overhead. Henry sat down, trying to steady his nerves, but his mind was racing. He knew something was terribly wrong. "Tell me everything you know," Ford said, her voice calm but direct. Henry took a deep breath. His marriage was complicated, a product of a modern relationship. He and Lily had been married for 5 years, but their relationship wasn't traditional. They had agreed on an open marriage early on, and while it was hard at times, it seemed to work for them. They both shared their secrets, their desires, but they always came back to each other. James was someone Henry had known for a long time. He was a confidant, a friend, and over time, something more. They had been partners in a deeper sense than just friends. That night, Henry had come home to find Lily and James in a compromising position, his wife and his lover in bed together. It wasn't the first time, but something about that night felt different. The weight of betrayal hung in the air, a feeling Henry couldn't shake off. I I found them," Henry muttered, his voice breaking. "Lily and James, they were in bed together, and I lost control. I I buried them, Ford. I buried them alive." Ford's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with interest. "Tell me exactly what happened, Sergeant." Henry closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. The events of the previous night were blurry, but the memories were vivid. He remembered the feeling of shock, the sudden surge of anger, and the cold, calculated thoughts that followed. He didn't know why, but the moment he saw them together, something inside him snapped. "I dug the holes in the backyard," Henry continued. "Lily was still alive when I buried her. I watched as the dirt covered her. And James, he didn't get a chance to say anything. I buried them both deep." Ford's eyes stayed fixed on him. She didn't show any emotion, but Henry could tell she was thinking, analyzing. It wasn't uncommon for someone in a volatile, emotional state to lash out. But this was different. Something wasn't adding up. "Did anyone witness this?" Ford asked, her voice calm but sharp. "No," Henry replied, his voice hoarse. "No one. It was just me." Ford nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "We need to investigate this, Sergeant. What you've said doesn't add up. There's more to this than meets the eye." Detective Jennifer Ford walked out of the interrogation room with a heavy heart. The sergeant's confession was chilling, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. Henry Owens had buried his wife and partner alive, but why? The act itself was horrific, but Ford had seen worse. What bothered her more was the story he had told. Ford was a veteran investigator, and she knew that people often lied when they were scared or desperate. But Henry seemed too detached, too calm. His emotions were buried beneath a wall of guilt, but Ford couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. She returned to her office and immediately began pulling the files. Lily Owens had been a teacher at the local high school, and James had been a contractor, but neither of them had any significant criminal background. Ford needed to get a better understanding of the couple, and she needed to speak with their friends, family, and anyone who might have seen anything unusual leading up to that night. The first call she made was to Lily's best friend, Vanessa. Vanessa had always been there for Lily, and Ford hoped that she might shed some light on the couple's complex marriage. Vanessa, this is Detective Ford. I'm investigating the death of Lily Owens. Can you tell me about your relationship with her? Ford asked. Vanessa's voice trembled on the other end of the line. Lily was, she was my best friend. I never thought, I never thought anything like this could happen. Ford listened closely. Vanessa explained that Lily had been happier than usual in the weeks leading up to her death. She had even mentioned feeling closer to both Henry and James, something about a new understanding in their open marriage. But there had been tension too. Lily had told Vanessa that Henry had grown more possessive, that he didn't like how close she was getting to James. Ford scribbled notes as Vanessa spoke. This was important. The cracks in their relationship had started to show long before that fateful night. But what was the real trigger? Why had Henry chosen to act in such a violent, final way? After speaking with Vanessa, Ford turned her attention to James's family. She spoke to his brother, Mike, who confirmed that James had been living a double life. James had been in a relationship with Henry, but he had also been seeing other men. Unbeknownst to Henry, Mike was hesitant, but Ford pressed him. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that there were layers to this story. Layers that didn't fit Henry's version of events. The investigation was just beginning, and Ford was sure that this case would be far more complicated than a simple crime of passion. Something was off, and Ford was determined to find out what. She couldn't let the truth be buried like the bodies in Henry's backyard. As Ford sat in her office, staring at the growing pile of evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case wasn't just about betrayal. It was about power, manipulation, and secrets. And in her gut, she knew that Henry Owens was hiding something much darker than he was willing to admit. Detective Ford sat at her cluttered desk, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows over the case files she had gathered. The walls of her office were lined with evidence boards, photographs, and notes, each one adding another layer to the mystery she was determined to solve. There was no denying it now. Henry Owens' confession didn't align with everything she was uncovering. Something was wrong. There had to be more to this than a jealous outburst fueled by betrayal. She took a long sip of her coffee, staring at the photo of Lily Owens on the top of the file. The image was a candid shot taken at a family event. Lily smiling, holding a glass of champagne, her arm around Henry's waist. The perfect picture of a happy couple. But Ford knew better. Perfect marriages didn't end in murder, especially not in such a calculated, gruesome manner. Her mind kept going back to Vanessa's words. Lily had seemed happy recently, closer than ever to both Henry and James. But there was something Vanessa hadn't said. Ford couldn't help but notice how carefully she had spoken, how hesitant she seemed to go into detail about the tensions between the couple. That was where Ford needed to dig deeper. She decided to return to the scene of the crime, the Owens house. The crime scene report had already been filed, but Ford wanted to take a closer look. She hoped to find something that hadn't been reported, a detail that might shed light on Henry's state of mind when he made the fatal decision to bury his wife and partner alive. The house was a small, two-story suburban home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in Treston. Ford pulled up to the curb, stepping out of her car and walking up to the front door. It had the appearance of any other home in the neighborhood. Neat, well-kept, nothing that screamed crime scene. But Ford's gut told her that this wasn't just an average domestic tragedy. She could feel the weight of the secrets pressing against her as she crossed the threshold into the house. Inside, the atmosphere was still heavy with the aftermath of the horrific act that had taken place here. The smell of old carpet and wood lingered in the air, but there was an almost eerie quietness in the house. The officers had already processed the scene, but Ford wasn't here to examine the obvious. She walked through the living room, her eyes scanning every corner for something that might reveal more about the relationship between Henry, Lily, and James. The walls were adorned with family photos, but none of them stood out. What Ford was looking for wasn't in the pictures. It was in the small details. She moved into the bedroom, where the gruesome discovery had been made. The bed was unmade, the sheets disheveled from the struggle that had clearly ensued. It was a stark contrast to the peaceful exterior of the home. Ford could see the marks where blood had stained the carpet, still faintly visible despite the cleaning efforts. But what caught her attention was the dresser. On top of it was a framed photo of Lily and James, together, smiling. Not a photo Henry would have kept, she thought. There was something off about it. A third-party photo, out of place in a supposedly monogamous relationship. Was it meant to be a clue? A signal? Ford examined it closely. The photograph wasn't old, but it was clear that it was one James had taken. She was starting to connect the dots between Henry's jealousy and James's secret life. But that wasn't all. There was something more, something lurking beneath the surface. The following day, Ford decided to speak to Henry again. She needed to confront him with her findings, push him to give her more of the truth. The first interrogation had left too many gaps, gaps that Henry had been too quick to cover with his confession. She walked into the interrogation room, the air thick with tension. Henry sat there, his posture rigid. His face was expressionless, but Ford could see the faintest tremor in his hands. The guilt was still there, but now there was a sense of unease that Ford couldn't ignore. "Sergeant Owens," Ford began, her voice calm but firm, "there are things about this case that don't add up. Your story, what you told us about burying Lily and James alive, it's too clean, too rehearsed. I need you to tell me everything." Henry swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. He was clearly struggling with the pressure, but Ford was patient. She didn't need him to confess. She just needed him to speak. "Why did you bury them?" Ford asked, leaning forward slightly. "You claim it was a crime of passion, but we both know there's more to it than that. You didn't just kill them. You buried them alive." Henry's gaze remained on the ground, his lips trembling. "It was a mistake," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to do it, but I couldn't take it anymore." "Take what?" Ford pressed, leaning in closer. "What couldn't you take?" He exhaled shakily and looked up at her, his eyes filled with torment. "The lies," he said softly. "The secrets. I found out everything, Ford. Everything." Ford didn't respond immediately. She had heard enough. There was something deeper here, something beyond jealousy or betrayal. Henry wasn't just a man who lost control. He was a man who felt completely powerless, and that was where the truth lay. "What did you find out?" Ford asked gently, now understanding that the cracks in their relationship ran far deeper than she had originally thought. Henry's voice was barely audible. "James had been seeing someone else. He was seeing men behind my back, men I didn't know about. He promised me that we were exclusive, but he lied. And Lily knew. She knew about everything. She just kept pretending." The anger in his voice was palpable now, but it was mixed with something else. Pain. It was the pain of being betrayed, not just by his wife, but by the one person he had trusted the most. "Why didn't you confront them earlier?" Ford asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She had a feeling Henry wasn't telling her everything. Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a sense of disbelief. "Because I wanted to believe them. I wanted to trust them. But when I saw them, together, in my bed, I knew it was all over." Ford leaned back, letting his words sink in. But she wasn't convinced. The story Henry had given her painted him as a man devastated by betrayal. But there was more. There had to be. Something wasn't right. As she stared at Henry, Ford realized this was only the beginning. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. This case was not just about infidelity or crime of passion. It was about control, manipulation, and a deadly secret that Henry was still trying to hide. And Ford was determined to find out what that secret was. Detective Jennifer Ford left the interrogation room with a heavy sense of uncertainty. Henry Owens's confession seemed to answer some questions, but it only raised more. There was a shift in his demeanor as he spoke. something deep and broken. He hadn't given the cold, detached response she expected. Instead, he'd shown a level of vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. And yet, Ford couldn't help but feel that the full picture remained hidden. As she walked through the hallways of the police station, Ford mulled over the details of Henry's confession. James had been seeing other men behind Henry's back. He had lied to him, and so had Lily. Ford had expected that kind of betrayal from someone in a complicated relationship like theirs, but the story didn't quite add up. What bothered her the most was Henry's final statement. "I wanted to believe them." It didn't sit right. Henry had confessed to murder, but his words indicated something more. Something about his own sense of power, or rather his complete lack of it. Ford sat in her office late into the evening, reviewing the case files again. She looked at the photographs of James and Lily, their smiles frozen in time. Were they really as happy as they appeared? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? The photograph on the dresser, the one Ford had found in the Owens' bedroom, kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't just an innocent picture of Lily and James. It was a deliberate message, one that Henry hadn't mentioned. She pulled out a folder marked Background Information, James Marshall, and flipped through the pages. James Marshall had been a quiet, reserved man. No criminal record, no history of violence. But there were whispers from those who knew him well. Ford found a report from a former coworker who mentioned that James had been a heavy drinker and had a reputation for being a charming manipulator. Those were telling words. James had a way of getting people to like him, to trust him, just like Henry had. But it was that very charm that could have hidden a much darker side. Ford knew she had to dig deeper into James' personal life. It wasn't just about his relationships with Henry and Lily. It was about his past, about any possible connections that could have led to this tragic outcome. She needed to find out if James had any enemies, any financial problems, or if there was anyone who might have had a reason to see him gone. The following morning, Ford visited James' apartment. The place was neat, sparse, a single man's home, devoid of personal warmth. The only pictures on the walls were of family, distant relatives that Ford could tell were probably taken years ago. It was strange, though. Something about the apartment felt off, cold. She could tell it was meticulously organized, but there was no real sign of life in it. No books, no music, no art. Ford made her way through the small living room and into the bedroom, where she found a small desk with papers scattered on top. One document caught her eye, a receipt for a plane ticket dated 2 weeks prior to a city far away. It didn't seem to fit with James's everyday life. Ford's curiosity piqued. Why was he traveling so far away? And why had he kept this receipt hidden in his bedroom? She pocketed the receipt and took photographs of the apartment, scanning for anything else out of place. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no indication that anyone had been hiding in this apartment, but the longer she spent there, the more she felt like James' life had been a carefully crafted facade. Ford called the airline to trace the plane ticket. As she waited on hold, her mind raced through the possibilities. Was James planning to leave? Was there someone else in the picture? Someone he had been planning to run away with? Had he been trying to escape from his life with Henry and Lily? The more Ford thought about it, the more the pieces started to make sense. If James had been seeing other men, if he had been leading a double life, the trip might have been his escape route. The airline's representative finally picked up the phone. Ford gave her the ticket number, and within moments, she had the details of James's flight. It wasn't to just any city. It was a one-way ticket to a remote town in the Pacific Northwest, and the date of the flight coincided with the days leading up to the night of the murders. Ford leaned back in her chair, feeling a chill run through her. James wasn't just trying to get away from Henry and Lily. He was running towards something, or someone. And whatever it was, it had to be the key to understanding why everything had gone so horribly wrong. With this new information, Ford made a decision to visit the town where James had been heading. It was a small, quiet place, far removed from the chaos of Treston, the kind of town where people disappeared without leaving much of a trace. Ford wasn't sure what she was looking for yet, but she knew she had to follow this lead. There was a bigger story here, something deeper than just a soldier's crime of passion. The following afternoon, Ford took a flight to the small town. It was raining when she arrived, and the cool, misty air made her feel uneasy. She rented a car and drove through winding roads, passing dense forests and fog-covered fields. The isolation was almost suffocating. When Ford finally reached the town, she went straight to the local sheriff's office. The sheriff was an older man with a gruff demeanor, but he was surprisingly helpful once Ford introduced herself as an investigator from Treston. "You're looking into James Marshall, huh?" the sheriff said as they sat down at his desk. "That name's familiar. He came through here a few weeks ago, stayed at the bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town." Ford's heart skipped a beat. A bed and breakfast? It was the last place she would have expected James to stay, especially given his secretive nature. She scribbled the name down in her notebook, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She asked the sheriff if anyone in town had seen James with anyone unusual during his stay. The sheriff paused, then mentioned that James had been particularly friendly with a man named Samuel Ray. According to the sheriff, Samuel was a local farmer, quiet but well-liked by the townspeople. Ford jotted the name down, but something about the connection felt off. A farmer in a remote town? And why had James been staying in a bed and breakfast instead of a regular hotel? Ford didn't waste any time. She drove to the bed and breakfast, hoping to speak to the owner. The place was quaint, nestled between towering pines. The owner, a woman in her mid-50s, greeted Ford with a warm smile, but her face changed when she heard the name James Marshall. "Oh, James," she said, her eyes flicking nervously. "He was here. Quiet guy. Stayed for 3 days. But after he left, he never paid his bill." Ford's mind began to race. Why had James been so secretive about his stay? And why had he left without paying? She pushed the owner for more details, and after some coaxing, she was able to get the name of the man James had spent time with, Samuel Ray. Ford drove out to Ray's farm, a sense of urgency mounting with every mile. When she arrived, Ray was working on the tractor, his broad shoulders hunched as he adjusted the engine. He was a big man, with calloused hands and a weathered face. But there was something about him that felt different, more dangerous than the typical farmer. Ray didn't seem surprised when Ford introduced herself. In fact, he looked almost relieved. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice low. "You've been digging around, haven't you?" Ford's heart raced. She knew in that moment that she was on the verge of uncovering something monumental. Samuel Ray knew far more than he was letting on, and Ford was about to find out just how deep the web of lies and manipulation went. "Tell me everything," Ford said, her voice steady. "Everything about James Marshall and why he came here." Ray looked at her, his eyes darkening, and then he spoke. Samuel Ray's farm was quiet, the only sound being the low hum of the tractor engine as he shut it off and wiped his hands on a dirty rag. His face remained unreadable, but there was a shift in his demeanor, a subtle tension that Ford couldn't ignore. He stood there looking at her as if weighing whether or not to speak. Ford had learned through years of experience that sometimes silence was more revealing than any words could be. She didn't rush him. Instead, she stood quietly, giving him the space he needed to decide what he wanted to reveal. Finally, Ray spoke, his voice rough, but with a trace of resolve. "I've been expecting you," he repeated, but this time with more conviction. "You want to know about James Marshall, and about the things he left behind." Ford narrowed her eyes, her mind clicking into investigative mode. "I need to understand what happened between you and James. Why did he come here? And why didn't he mention you in his personal life? The man he was with in Treston, his partner. Why didn't he mention you when I spoke to his friends in town?" Ray's eyes flitted away briefly, and he let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. "James was never the kind of man to talk about his life, not with anyone. But you should know that the James you're asking about wasn't the same man when he came here." Ford raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ray met her gaze directly for the first time, his eyes hard and cold. He was running from something, not just from his wife, not just from his partner. He was running from himself, and the thing he was most afraid of was losing control. Ford had expected a confession that would tie together the scattered pieces of the case. Henry, Lily, James. What she wasn't expecting was a cryptic statement like this, one that only deepened the mystery. "I need more than that, Samuel. I need specifics. What were you to him? Ray stared at her, weighing his options. For a moment it seemed like he might shut down completely, but then, with a long, drawn-out breath, he finally spoke again, this time with more clarity. I'm not just a farmer, Ray began slowly. I used to run in circles where people don't ask questions, where things are done a little differently. I met James a few months before all this mess started. He came to town for reasons he didn't explain, but he was looking for something, a way out, a way to escape, whatever it was haunting him back in Treston. Ford's curiosity spiked. Escape from what? Ray's mouth twitched slightly, like he was considering how much to reveal. A man like James, he was never going to be happy with just one life, just one identity. The man he showed the world, husband, partner, good guy, wasn't the real James. The real James was someone who needed to be someone else when things got hard. He found that someone in me. Ford's mind raced. A dual life. That wasn't new, but this was something darker, something deeper. You're saying that James had an affair with you? Ray shook his head, his expression darkening. It wasn't just an affair. He needed me, Jennifer, and not in the way you think. We didn't just sleep together. He came here to me because he wanted to understand something about himself, about who he really was. He was confused, lost, and he couldn't go back to his life in Treston, not after what he'd done. Ford took a step forward, trying to piece together the fragments of the story. What did he do? Ray didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be weighing whether or not he should answer the question. After a long silence, he finally looked at Ford and said, James had secrets, Jennifer. Things he didn't want anyone to know. Not even Henry, not even Lily. Did he hurt someone? Did he do something illegal? Ford pressed. Ray's eyes flickered to the ground. No, but he did something worse. He betrayed a trust that changed everything. Ford felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just about a simple affair or betrayal. It was something far more complicated, something so big that it could break apart the whole facade of James Marshall's life. What happened, Samuel? Ford's voice softened. What are you not telling me? Ray's jaw tightened and he turned away, walking to the edge of the farm. Ford followed him, knowing that whatever he was holding back, he would only reveal it when he was ready. But it was clear that Ray was conflicted about coming forward. After a long pause, Ray spoke, his voice low, as if afraid someone might overhear. James had been seeing someone else, a man. But that wasn't the part he was hiding, the part that messed him up. He got tangled up in something dangerous, someone dangerous, a man named Alexander. Ford's heart skipped. Alexander? She repeated. Who is he? And what does he have to do with this? Ray hesitated, and then he turned back to face Ford. James got too close. Alexander wasn't just anyone. He's got connections, powerful ones, dangerous ones, the kind of people who don't let their business get exposed, the kind of people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. Ford's pulse quickened. Is that why James left? Did he run from Alexander? Did he fear for his life? Ray nodded grimly. That's exactly why James came to me. He thought he could disappear here, start fresh, but he couldn't escape. Not from his past, not from the people who were after him. Ford's mind was reeling now. But what does this have to do with Lily and Henry? Why did James stay with them if he was running from something so dangerous? Ray stepped closer, his expression conflicted. James loved them, Jennifer. But there was more. There was a game he was playing, a dangerous game where nothing was what it seemed. Lily and Henry weren't just his partners. They were pawns in a bigger scheme. James thought he could control it all. He thought he could have both worlds. But it all fell apart. Ford took a deep breath, absorbing everything she had just learned. So James wasn't just unfaithful. He was involved with dangerous people, and he dragged Lily and Henry into this mess. But why? Why would he put them in danger? Ray looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. James wanted to keep everything under control, Jennifer. He couldn't handle losing either of them. He loved Lily in his own way. But he needed Henry too. Henry was his anchor, his foundation. And when Lily found out about what was really going on, she made him choose. He couldn't lose either of them, but he didn't want to risk anyone knowing the truth about his past. It was his secret to keep. Ford felt a wave of realization wash over her. James had been living a lie, but Lily and Henry were caught in the crossfire. And that night, when Henry found them in bed together, it wasn't just about jealousy. It was about everything coming to a head. Henry found out about the danger James had brought into their lives. He saw the full extent of the betrayal. Ray didn't respond, but Ford could see the truth in his eyes. Henry hadn't just been angry with Lily and James. He had been terrified. Terrified of the dangerous web James had spun, the enemies he had made, and the people who might come after them all. Ford walked back to her car, her mind whirling with the revelations she had uncovered. It wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a story of manipulation, secrets, and a web of lies spun by a man who had tried to escape his past. But in the end, he had dragged the people closest to him into a nightmare they couldn't escape. The deeper Ford dug, the more she realized how much there was left to uncover. The connection between Henry, Lily, James, and Alexander was just the beginning. There was still one question left unanswered, the one that would make everything fall into place. Who was Alexander and how far did his influence reach? Detective Jennifer Ford had always known that the key to unraveling a case lay in the small details, those seemingly insignificant pieces that, when connected, told the full story. But as she sat in her hotel room, reviewing the recent interviews and new evidence, she felt a growing sense of dread. The pieces of this puzzle were scattered far and wide, each one pointing to a deeper, darker truth. A truth that was being carefully concealed by the very people involved in the case, and one name echoed in her mind with chilling clarity: Alexander. The mention of Alexander by Samuel Ray had sent a ripple through the investigation. Until now, Ford had been focused on the relationships between Henry, Lily, and James. But Alexander, the man who had come into James's life like a shadow, was the key to understanding everything. He was the reason James had been running, the reason for the betrayal, and she now realized the reason for the murders. But who was Alexander? And what kind of hold did he have over James, and by extension, Henry and Lily? Ford knew that to understand Alexander's role, she would need to dig deeper into the criminal underworld that he was likely a part of. And as she pored over her notes, it became clear. Alexander wasn't just a man. He was a figure that moved through the shadows, a name whispered in fear, connected to organizations whose influence reached far beyond the small town of Treston. The next morning, Ford took the first flight back to Treston. Her meeting with Ray had uncovered more than she had expected, but it had also left her with more questions than answers. The quiet farm had revealed its secrets, but the real monster remained elusive. The connections between Alexander, James, and the people James had loved were murky, and Ford needed more. When Ford returned to the Treston Police Department, she went straight to the evidence room. She needed to see everything she could find on James's background. In her haste, she began scanning old files, searching for any mention of Alexander. Anything that might tie him to James, or better yet, to Henry and Lily. And then, buried in a dusty file marked James Marshall, personal background, she found it. A report from an old acquaintance of James, a former military comrade who had been in the same unit as James during his time in the Army. The report was brief, but it contained one crucial detail: Alexander's name. It turned out that James and Alexander had met during James' deployment overseas. Alexander had been a contractor working with a private security firm, one that operated in the gray areas of international law. Ford's mind raced. Private security contractors, mercenaries, they operated in the shadows. The connections they had weren't always legal, and their ties often reached into the dark corners of politics and organized crime. James hadn't just run into Alexander by chance. No, this had been a calculated move. James had been involved with someone dangerous, someone who could pull strings. Ford took the information to the chief. She was getting closer to understanding just how deep the conspiracy went. The chief listened as she laid out the details, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You think James was caught up in something illegal?" the chief asked, rubbing his chin. "I don't think he was just caught up in something. Ford replied. I think he was a part of it. I think James was hiding a darker side of his life, one that involved working with people like Alexander. Are you saying that James's death wasn't just about jealousy? The chief asked, his voice tightening. Ford shook her head. Number, it's more than that. James was involved in something far more dangerous, and Henry and Lily, no matter how much they loved him, were dragged into it. If we want to understand why James ended up dead, we have to understand Alexander's role. Ford knew she needed to speak to someone who had dealt directly with private contractors like Alexander. She reached out to her contact at the FBI, a seasoned agent who specialized in organized crime and international operations. It wasn't long before she received a call back. Jennifer, you're digging into some dangerous territory. Alexander isn't just a name you throw around lightly, the agent warned. He's tied to several groups we've been tracking. There's not much on him, but the people he associates with are involved in arms trafficking, human trafficking, you name it. Ford's stomach churned at the agent's words. This was no ordinary criminal. Alexander wasn't just dangerous, he was untouchable. Do you have anything on him? Anything at all? Ford pressed. The agent hesitated before answering. I'll send you what we have, but be careful, Jennifer. The people around Alexander don't just disappear, they get buried. Ford took the agent's warning seriously, but she couldn't stop now, not when she was this close to the truth. Later that day, she received the files from the FBI. There were pictures, brief statements, and a few bits of intelligence that painted a picture of Alexander. He wasn't just a mercenary, he was a man who had built a network of loyal followers, people who would do anything for him. And James? James had been one of those people. Ford pieced together the information. Alexander and James had worked together on several operations, mostly overseas, but their relationship had become more than just professional. James had gotten caught up in something larger, something far beyond his control. The night James was found dead with Lily and Henry, Ford now understood, wasn't just the result of a heated argument. It had been a culmination of a life full of lies, secrets, and debts that James could never repay. And in the end, the only way to protect Lily and Henry from the repercussions of James's actions had been for Henry to do the unthinkable. But there was more. Ford had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, something she hadn't expected. Alexander had known about Henry's military background. He had known that Henry was capable of extreme violence, and he had used that to his advantage. The breakthrough came when Ford uncovered an encrypted message on James's laptop, one that had been hidden in plain sight. The message was brief, but it was clear. James had been in contact with Alexander right before his death. The message read, "I've paid my dues. They won't stop. Henry is the key. He's the only one who can stop them." Ford's heart sank. The message was a confession of sorts. James had known that he couldn't protect Lily or Henry from the forces that were closing in on them. He had tried to make amends, but it was too late. The debt was too large to settle. Henry had been the one to finally put an end to it, to protect his family. Ford took all the evidence back to the department, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She knew what she had to do. She would arrest Henry, but the arrest would be more complicated than any case she had worked before. It wasn't just about justice. It was about understanding the full extent of the danger that had driven Henry to commit murder. She walked into the interrogation room where Henry sat, his face a mask of grief, his eyes hollow with regret. She had been right. He hadn't just killed James out of anger. He had killed him to protect Lily, to protect them both from the dangerous world James had dragged them into. Ford took a seat across from Henry. She didn't speak right away. There were no more questions to ask. Only the truth remained. "Henry," Ford said softly, her voice low, "you did what you thought you had to. But there's a bigger story here, a story about the danger James brought into your life and the lives of the people you loved." Henry's eyes flickered with something between guilt and relief. "I didn't have a choice." Ford leaned forward, her voice calm. "I know, but now it's time for the truth to come out. The full truth." The tension in the small interrogation room was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Henry sat across from Detective Jennifer Ford, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. His face was drawn, tired, but his eyes, those eyes, still held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much, who had been forced to make decisions no one should ever have to make. Ford's mind raced as she sat there in silence, letting the weight of the situation settle around them. Henry had already admitted to the murders of James and Lily. He had confessed to burying their bodies, to covering up the crime. But the confession felt incomplete, like there was a missing piece, an unspoken truth that neither of them had yet to confront. Ford knew she was close to understanding the full scope of what had happened. She had all the pieces: Ray's statements, the FBI files, the encrypted message, and her own investigation into James's involvement with Alexander. But one thing still didn't add up. Why had Henry been so sure that killing James and Lily was the only way to protect them? "Henry," Ford said, her voice gentle but firm, "you told me before that you killed them to protect them. But from what? What exactly were you protecting them from?" Henry's shoulders tensed. His gaze flickered to the door, as if he could escape the room just by looking at the exit. "From him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "From Alexander." Ford's heart skipped a beat. The name had come up before, but now it was clear. Henry had known just how dangerous Alexander truly was. The connection between him and James was more than just professional. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. "You knew what Alexander was capable of," Ford said, her eyes narrowing. "You knew he would come after you all. But why didn't you say anything before? Why didn't you tell me?" Henry looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. His expression was filled with a mixture of anger, pain, and regret. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," he said quietly. "No one would have. People like Alexander don't just disappear. They don't play by the rules. And when you get involved with someone like him, there's no going back. There's only survival." Ford absorbed his words, her mind churning. She had been so focused on the personal dynamics between James, Lily, and Henry that she hadn't fully considered the kind of danger they were in. She had thought James was the cause of the tragedy, but now it was clear that Alexander, the man who had controlled James, who had pulled the strings, was the real threat. Henry continued, his voice more steady now, as if he were finally letting the truth spill out. James thought he could outrun the people who had control over him. He thought he could protect us, that he could live two lives. But when Alexander found out he was trying to leave, he made sure that James would never escape. He killed Lily because she knew too much, and he would have come for me next. Ford's stomach churned at the coldness of Henry's words. It was clear now that James's death had been part of a larger game, one that had involved deceit, betrayal, and the ruthless power of men like Alexander. But why had Henry chosen to take matters into his own hands? Why had he killed Lily? "I couldn't let her suffer," Henry muttered, his eyes distant now, as if he were reliving the moment in his mind. "James loved her, but she didn't deserve to die. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this. I couldn't let Alexander have her, so I made the choice. I had to stop it all." Ford nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her. Henry hadn't killed Lily out of rage or jealousy. He had done it out of a twisted sense of protection, a belief that by ending her life, he was sparing her from a much worse fate. But what Henry hadn't realized was that his actions had spiraled into an even darker, irreversible tragedy. "So, you buried them. You tried to hide what happened," Ford said softly. "But that's not the whole story, is it? There's more to it than just you protecting Lily and James. You were running from something too, weren't you?" Henry swallowed hard. "I didn't have a choice. I had to protect myself too. If I'd left them there, if I'd gone to the police, Alexander would have come for me. He would have killed me, just like he did with James." Ford leaned in, her voice steady but probing. "You were afraid of him. I get that. But you knew what you were doing. You knew that by taking things into your own hands, you were making things worse. You didn't just kill James and Lily. You buried their bodies. You buried the truth. And now it's all coming back." Henry's eyes welled up, but he blinked the tears away quickly. "I didn't know what else to do. he said in a near whisper. I thought if I could just hide it, if I could just protect Lily from him and keep everyone safe, then maybe it would all go away. But it didn't. It's never going to go away. Ford could see the anguish in his eyes, the guilt, the shame, the realization that he had taken a life in a desperate attempt to prevent something worse from happening. But the truth, no matter how painful, had a way of rising to the surface. And now, for better or worse, Henry was about to face the consequences of his actions. Ford paused, letting the silence settle between them. She had a decision to make. Henry's confession had shattered the illusion of a simple love triangle gone wrong. This wasn't just a case of infidelity or jealousy. This was a story of manipulation, fear, and the deadly consequences of being involved with someone like Alexander. Henry, Ford said after a long pause, her voice hardening, you've admitted to the murders, but I need to make it clear that there's more to this than just protecting yourself or your family. There are people out there, dangerous people, who need to be held accountable for their role in this. Alexander is still out there, and his network is still operating in the shadows. You may have thought you were saving Lily, but in the end, you became a part of something much bigger, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. Henry nodded slowly, his face etched with the weight of everything he had done. He understood now that the web he had woven with his actions couldn't be unraveled easily, but the truth would come out, no matter how much blood had been spilled to keep it hidden. Ford stood up, looking down at Henry one last time. The man who had been trying so hard to protect those he loved had now become a prisoner of his own choices. She couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him, but one thing was certain. He was no longer running from the truth. As she walked out of the interrogation room, Ford's mind was already on the next steps. There was more to uncover about Alexander, more to learn about his connections and the dark world he inhabited. But for now, she had the answers she needed. James Marshall's death had been the spark that set everything in motion. Lily's death had been the result of a desperate attempt to protect someone she loved. And Henry? Henry had become both victim and perpetrator in a twisted story that no one could have predicted. The investigation was far from over. But as Ford stepped out into the cold morning light, she knew one thing for sure. The truth had finally begun to surface, and no one, least of all Alexander, could stop it.